December 14th, 2003. A place where older people live and get care. In Philadelphia, a very old man is dying. His body is very sick from cancer. His mind may be finally feeling light enough to speak. Frank Sheeran is 83 years old. He was a soldier in World War II who got medals. He used to drive big trucks. People say he was a murderer for hire. He has only a few days left to live, and he has a story he wants to tell. I heard you paint houses, he says. His voice is very quiet, almost a whisper. This is a special saying in the world of gangsters. This sentence means something much scarier than fixing up a home. It means, I heard you kill people. The blood, that is the paint. The walls and the floors, those are the houses for many, many years. One question has bothered the American police, interested people who write the news, and created lots of ideas and guesses. What happened to Jimmy Hoffa? On July 30th, 1975, James Riddle Hoffa disappeared. He was the past president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, which is a very big and powerful group for workers. He was one of the most strong and talked about union leaders in all of American history. He vanished without any clue from a restaurant parking lot near Detroit. No body was ever found, no weapon was ever found. No clear answers, just ideas, guesses, and quiet from people who might know what is true. This lasted until Frank Sheeran decided he would talk. Did this man, this Philadelphia truck driver who became friends with gangsters, really kill Jimmy Hoffa? Did he shoot the gun for one of the most famous missing person cases in America that was never solved? Or is this the last trick? A dying man's last try to become famous. This is a story that covers 50 years. It connects the fighting fields of World War II to the dark and secret world of gangster groups. From the halls of Union power to the hidden rooms where the most dangerous men in America made choices that changed the whole country. This is the true story behind Martin Scorsese's huge movie, The Irishman. This is where a great movie meets cold, hard truth. This is where written down history meets a confession given right before death. This is where the dream of America shows its very darkest side. Before we start this trip into one of the most interesting true crime stories in American history, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching this from right now? What time is it where you are? Type your place and time in the comments below. I really like seeing how our group of people watching is spread all over the world, all joined together by being interested in these real stories that built America. And if you are ready to spend the next few hours going very deep into the real gangsters behind The Irishman, press that subscribe button, hit that like button hard, and send this to anyone you know who loves true crime. Believe me, you will want to get settled in. Maybe get a drink, get cozy. This is going to be a very long trip, but I promise you every single minute is worth it. Welcome to Late Night Stories About Gangsters. You already know where you heard it first. Now, let's start at the very beginning, with a boy from Philadelphia who would grow up to be a man who could do terrible, violent things. Francis Joseph Sheeran was born on October 25, 1920, in Camden, New Jersey. That is right across the Delaware River from Philadelphia. But it was in the Irish Catholic parts of Philadelphia where young Frank really became who he was. It was there he learned the lessons that would make his future in ways nobody could have guessed. The Sheeran family was a working Irish family. They were the kind of family that knew about very hard times very well. Frank's father worked when he could find a job during the Great Depression, which was a time when many people had no work. That was not very often. Philadelphia in the 1920s and 1930s was a city of very big differences. There were rich neighborhoods in very poor city areas, often only a few streets apart. The Irish parts of town where Frank grew up were tough places. Boys learned early how to use their fists to fight. Being loyal to your own people meant everything. The line between honest work and crime could get fuzzy, depending on what you needed to do to feed your family. Frank grew to be very tall, finally reaching 6 feet and 4 inches. He also grew to be tough. In later years, he would talk about his childhood in a plain way, without strong feeling or feeling sorry for himself. It was just the way life was. You worked. You fought when you had to. You took care of your own people. The idea of honor that would later fill his understanding of gangster life started right here, on these streets, with this rule of loyalty and toughness. By the time he was a teenager, Frank was working small jobs, doing whatever needed to be done. He was not a bad kid in the usual way. He had no record of being arrested when he was young. He was not in a street gang that we know about. But he was learning something very important. He was learning how to move in a world where being strong mattered more than rules, where knowing the right people could mean the difference between having food to eat and being hungry. Then came December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor was attacked. Everything changed. Frank Sheeran was taken into the United States Army in 1941, right as America entered World War II. He was put into the 45th Infantry Division, called the Thunderbirds. This group would see some of the most cruel fighting in the European part of the war. This is where Frank Sheeran learned how to kill. This is where he found out something about himself that would decide the rest of his life. The 45th Infantry Division arrived in Sicily in July 1943 as part of Operation Husky. That was the Allied attack on Italy. From there, they fought their way up the Italian land. Salerno, Anzio, the bloody push toward Rome. The fighting was brutal. Close-up combat in old towns and villages, going from house to clear them, where you learned to shoot first or you would die. Frank was 22 years old, tall and strong. He turned out to be very good at the grim job of infantry fighting. The men in charge above him noticed. They gave him special jobs. From what he said later, he got involved in missions that needed a special coldness, a special willingness to do what others might be afraid to do. The freeing of the Dachau concentration camp in April 1945 by groups, including the 45th Infantry Division, became something people argued about later when they talked of Sheeran's service. What happened right after? Reports say some German SS guards were killed right away by angry American soldiers. This is still argued about today. Sheeran would later say he was part of such payback killings, describing them without feeling as simply what was done when everyone was very angry. Whether this exact claim is true, made bigger, or not proven, what cannot be denied is that Sheeran was part of long, brutal fighting all across Europe. The 45th Infantry Division got many awards. The men who served in it saw things that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. For Frank Sheeran, the war years were very important in a specific, awful way. He learned that killing, when allowed by the people in charge, when done for the right reasons, was not just okay, but was something to be praised. He learned that he could do it without falling apart, without losing sleep, without the moral pain that might bother other men. He developed, or maybe showed, a skill for violence that was clinical, professional, and without emotion. This is very important to understand everything that came later. Frank Sheeran did not become a killer, even though he was a good man. He became a killer because he found out in the heat of war that he had a special talent for it. And in the America he came back to in 1945, there were people who would find that talent very, very useful. Frank Sheeran came home to Philadelphia with medals. He got awards, including the Bronze Star. He should have been set for a good life. The GI Bill promised schooling, help getting a house, a way into America's successful middle class. The boom after the war was starting. Jobs were easy to find. The future looked bright, but for Frank, like for many soldiers who saw combat, peacetime was harder than war. He had trouble getting used to normal life. The skills that made him useful in war, being super alert, the ability for instant violence, the emotional distance, these were problems in everyday life. He married Mary Leigh, an Irish girl from the neighborhood. In 1946, he tried to settle down. To build a regular life, he got work as a truck driver. Carrying loads up and down the East Coast, it was honest work, union work. Driving big trucks filled with things going to America's growing buying economy. The Teamsters union stood for truck drivers. And Frank joined. It seemed like a solid path, good pay, protection from the union, a respectable working-class life. But Frank could not sit still. The money from truck driving, while okay, was never quite enough. He had a family that was getting bigger. In the end, he and Mary would have 4 daughters. And he had learned something during the war. Rules could bend, especially when you had the power to bend them. Like many truck drivers in the late 1940s, Frank started to add to his income by stealing. It started small, a box of cigarettes here, some goods that fell off the truck there. The companies that hired truck drivers expected a certain amount of loss. It was almost accepted, a gray area between real business and small crime. But Frank was working in a place that was not innocent at all. The trucking business in America, after the war, was full of organized crime. The gangsters controlled the unions. The unions controlled the drivers. And the drivers controlled the way to the goods that millions of Americans wanted to buy. It was a perfect setup for organized theft. Threats and corruption. Frank's stealing got attention. Not from the police, at least not at first, but from people who were experts in this kind of operation. People who could organize stolen goods into businesses that made money. People who were always looking for reliable men who could handle themselves, who knew how to keep quiet, who could use violence when needed. People like Russell Bufalino. The exact details of how Frank Sheeran first met Russell Bufalino are not clear. They are lost to time and stories that don't match. What we know is that by the early 1950s, Frank had come to the notice of the Bufalino crime family. This was one of the most powerful and most quiet gangster groups in America. Russell Bufalino himself was not the kind of gangster you read about in newspaper headlines. He did not look for attention. He did not dress in a flashy way or talk loudly. He was a quiet man who spoke softly, was smart, and understood that the best way to use power was to stay unseen. While other gangster bosses were becoming famous, on the covers of magazines, being dragged in front of Senate groups, Russell Bufalino ran his operation from the small town of Kingston, Pennsylvania, in the coal area of northeastern Pennsylvania. But do not let the country location fool you. The Bufalino family, even though it was based far from New York or Chicago, was deeply connected to the national crime syndicate. Russell Bufalino sat on the commission. That was the ruling group of the American Mafia. He was asked for advice on big decisions. He was respected by the most powerful gangster bosses in the country, and he saw something in Frank Sheeran. Maybe it was Frank's size, its scary physical presence. Maybe it was his army background, the discipline, the training, the proven ability for violence. Maybe it was simpler than that. Russell needed reliable men, and Frank needed money and a purpose. Their relationship started with small jobs. Frank would later describe it as almost like a father and son. Russell treated him with respect, even with affection. Russell was the kind of boss who did not yell or make threats. He spoke quietly, in a reasonable way. And men did what he asked, because they understood what would happen if they didn't. Without anything being said out loud, Frank started doing hijackings. Those are organized truck thefts, where the goods would be sold through networks controlled by gangsters. He collected debts, encouraging people who owed money to Russell's businesses to pay up, using his big physical presence, and when needed, violence. He became someone who made people do things. A problem solver, a man Russell could depend on. The money was good, better than truck driving could ever give. And Frank found out something else. He was good at this work. The violence did not bother him. The moral gray area did not trouble him. He had found his calling by the middle of the 1950s. Frank Sheeran had crossed the line. He was no longer a truck driver who sometimes bent the rules. He was a career criminal, a close helper of the Bufalino crime family. He had not been officially made a member. That honor was saved for men of Italian family background. But he was close enough. He was trusted. He was valued. He was in the outer circle of the mob world. And that connection would finally lead him to the most powerful union leader in America. A man whose name would become linked with corruption, power, and in the end, one of history's greatest mysteries. But to understand how Frank Sheeran's path met with Jimmy Hoffa's, we first need to understand the world Russell Bufalino controlled. We need to understand the setup of the crime family that would shape American organized crime for many years. To understand Russell Bufalino is to understand a different kind of gangster, one whose power came not from being flashy or violent, but from being careful, smart, and thinking ahead. He was born Rosario Alfredo Bufalino in Sicily in 1903. Russell came to the United States with his family as a child, settling in Buffalo, New York. From there, the family finally moved to the coal areas of northeastern Pennsylvania, where chances in both honest and dishonest businesses were plenty. By the 1940s, Russell Bufalino had risen to become the boss of what would be called the Bufalino crime family, sometimes called the Northeastern Pennsylvania crime family. His area included the cities and towns of Pennsylvania's coal country: Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, Pittston, Kingston. It also included operations reaching into upstate New York and beyond. What made Bufalino different from other gangster bosses was how little he was seen. While others like Carlo Gambino in New York or Sam Giancana in Chicago were becoming names everyone knew, dragged before Senate groups and plastered over newspapers, Russell Bufalino stayed almost unknown to the American public. He lived in a modest way in Kingston. He ran a real business, a jewelry store and a taxi service. As fronts, he dressed in a plain way, drove normal cars, and stayed away from the kind of showy displays of money that got the police's attention. But those in the criminal world knew Russell Bufalino's real power. He sat on the Mafia Commission. That was the ruling group that settled fights between the 5 families of New York and crime families across the country. His opinion was asked for on big decisions. His word had weight. Bufalino's power came from a few places. First, his control of the Teamsters union in his area, through threats, corruption, and smart alliances. The Bufalino family effectively controlled trucking in much of Pennsylvania and New York. This gave them huge power, the ability to mess up supply chains, to organize theft operations, to force money from businesses that needed reliable transportation. Second, his connections to other powerful crime families. Bufalino had close friendships with the leaders of Philadelphia, New York, and Detroit mob families. He was a helper, a problem solver, someone who could make deals and keep peace between groups that wanted different things. Third, his intelligence and caution. Russell Bufalino understood that staying out of jail meant avoiding attention. He almost never used the telephone for criminal business. He met in person, in private, speaking carefully and thinking someone might be listening. He protected himself with layers of men under him who did the direct criminal activities, while Russell stayed at a distance. By the 1950s and into the 1960s, the Bufalino crime family was at its highest power. It controlled a criminal empire that made millions of dollars every year through gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, drug moving, and organized theft operations. And at the center of their labor racketeering operations was their friendship with the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. This union would become both the source of their greatest power and, in the end, the reason for their most famous crime. The Bufalino crime family, while smaller than the big New York families, was very well organized and disciplined. Understanding how it was set up helps explain how it could have such big influence. At the top, of course, was Russell Bufalino himself, the boss. The Don, the final authority. His word was the law inside the organization. Under him was an underboss. Usually this was his cousin, William Big Billy Bufalino. He helped run the everyday operations and was a top advisor. Then came the capos, or captains. They controlled groups of made men and helpers. Each capo had his own area, or specialty. Some controlled gambling operations, others ran labor racketeering. Others were experts in loan sharking or theft rings, made members. Or made men, or wise guys, were brought into the family through a formal ceremony where they swore omerta, the code of silence. They were only men of Italian family background. Following Mafia tradition, these men had proven themselves through years of criminal activity and complete loyalty. They had shown they were willing to kill if told to. They had shown they could make money and share the profits with the men above them. Below the made members were the associates, men like Frank Sheeran, who worked for the family but were not officially brought in. Associates might be Irish, Jewish, or other backgrounds. They could be very trusted and valuable, but they would never sit at the top table. They would never be made. This was an ethnic line that even the most loyal Irish or Jewish criminals could never cross. The Bufalino family's criminal operations were many kinds. Labor racketeering. This was maybe their most money-making operation. By controlling important unions, especially in the Teamsters, they could force money from businesses, organize theft operations, and clean dirty money through union pension funds. Gambling. They ran huge gambling operations all through their area. Number games, sports betting, card games. Gambling made a steady flow of cash and was a way to clean money from other criminal activities. Loan sharking. They gave loans with very high interest to people who could not get normal credit, collecting through threats and violence when needed. Theft and hijacking. Organized theft of goods from trucks, warehouses, and shipping places, and selling them through networks controlled by gangsters. Drug moving. Even though some older gangsters did not like drug dealing, by the 1960s most families, including the Bufalinos, were part of the very profitable drug trade, real businesses, like all mob families. The Bufalinos put their criminal profits into real businesses. Restaurants, bars, taxi services, trucking companies, real estate. These gave them income, respectability, and ways to clean money. What lifted the Bufalino family from a local crime group to a nationally important organization was Russell's seat on the Mafia Commission. Made in 1931 by Lucky Luciano, the commission was created to stop the kind of gangster wars that had hurt the criminal world in the 1920s. It included people from the major crime families and served as a ruling council, settling fights, agreeing to big hits, and planning strategy. Russell Bufalino's place on the commission. Even though he ran a fairly small family from country Pennsylvania, showed his intelligence and political skills, he was a peacemaker, a voice of reason. Someone the more easily upset bosses could trust to be fair and quiet. This commission membership connected Russell to the most powerful gangster bosses in America. During the 1950s and 1960s, Carlo Gambino was the boss of New York's largest crime family. He was maybe the most powerful gangster in America during this time. Vito Genovese was boss of the family that would have his name. He was one of the most violent and ambitious mob leaders of his time. Santo Trafficante Jr. was boss of the Tampa, Florida family. He had big operations in Cuba before Castro's revolution. Sam Giancana was Chicago's flashy boss. He would later be connected to plans involving the CIA and Fidel Castro. Russell Bufalino's friendships with these men meant that when he needed something, he could ask for help far beyond his own family. And when they needed something, especially anything involving the Teamsters Union, they would call on Russell, because Russell Bufalino had something none of the other bosses could match: a direct line to Jimmy Hoffa. Understanding why the Teamsters mattered so much to organized crime needs an understanding of what the Union meant in America after the war. The International Brotherhood of Teamsters was started in 1903 to stand for workers who drove teams of horses. By the 1950s, it had changed into the Union for truck drivers, warehouse workers, and similar jobs all across America. And in an economy more and more needing trucking to move goods from factories to stores, the Teamsters had huge power. If Teamsters went on strike, goods did not move. Stores ran out of things to sell. Factories could not ship products. Supply chains stopped completely. This gave the Union great strength in talks, the ability to bring business to a stop until their demands were met. For organized crime, the Teamsters meant several chances. Access to goods. Truck drivers controlled the way to millions of dollars worth of goods being moved. Organized theft operations needed help from drivers and warehouse workers. Chances to force money. Businesses desperate to avoid strikes would pay protection money to make sure there was labor peace. Pension fund control. The Teamster Central States Pension Fund would grow to hold billions of dollars. Those who controlled how that money was invested could give loans to businesses controlled by gangsters. This was basically treating the pension fund like a private bank. Political power. With over 1 million members by the 1960s, the Teamsters had big political influence, especially in swing states. This gave union leaders away to politicians at the highest levels by the 1950s. Organized crime had completely gotten into the Teamsters at every level. Local unions were controlled by gangsters or mob helpers. Regional leaders were either corrupt or scared, and at the very top, working his way up through the ranks with a mix of real organizing skill and smart alliances with organized crime, was a man who would become one of the most argued about people in American history: James Riddle Hoffa. Russell Bufalino saw Jimmy Hoffa's potential early. Through William Bufalino, Russell's cousin who worked as a Teamsters lawyer, the Bufalino family made a friendship with Hoffa that would prove very valuable. They helped him in his rise through the Union. They gave him muscle when he needed it. They supported him in the brutal inside Union politics that marked the Teamsters. And in return, Jimmy Hoffa would give them access to the greatest source of gangster wealth in American history. But understanding that friendship needs understanding Jimmy Hoffa himself, who he was, where he came from, and how a working-class kid from Detroit became the most powerful labor leader in America. James Riddle Hoffa was born on February 14, 1913, in Brazil, Indiana. That is a small town in the western part of the state. His father, John Hoffa, died when Jimmy was only 7 years old. This left his mother, Viola, to raise 4 children alone during the economically hard 1920s. The family struggled. Viola took in laundry, did whatever work she could find. Young Jimmy learned early that the world was not kind to people without power. That surviving needed toughness and a strong will. These lessons would shape his whole way of union organizing. In 1924, the family moved to Detroit, looking for better chances in the growing car industry. Detroit in the 1920s was a city changed by Henry Ford's assembly lines. It pulled workers from all across America and around the world. It was a place where fortunes could be made, but also where workers were often treated like disposable parts in the big industrial machine. Jimmy left school after the 9th grade. School was a luxury the family could not afford. He needed to work to help the family. He took whatever jobs he could find, finally getting work at a grocery warehouse. He loaded and unloaded trucks for very low pay in dangerous conditions. It was here, in the warehouse, that Jimmy Hoffa first met the power of acting together. In 1932, 19-year-old Jimmy Hoffa and his co-workers at the Kroger grocery warehouse decided they had had enough. The pay was terrible, 32 cents an hour. The hours were long, and you never knew when you'd work. The work was back-breaking. The management treated them with a kind of, like they were bodies that could be easily replaced. Jimmy helped organize a work stoppage. When a load of strawberries arrived, these were fruits that would go bad if not unloaded fast. The workers refused to touch them until management agreed to talk about better conditions. It was a bold move. It could have ended their jobs if it failed. It worked. The management, facing the loss of the whole shipment, agreed to recognize the workers' representatives and talk about better conditions. It was Jimmy Hoffa's first taste of power, the understanding that workers organized and standing together could force even powerful companies to the table. He was hooked. He had found his calling. Jimmy threw himself into union organizing. He worked with Teamsters Local 299 in Detroit. He was fearless, charming, and smart. He understood that organizing workers was not just about giving speeches. It was about showing them real benefits, protecting them from payback, and being willing to really fight if needed. Because organizing in the 1930s and 1940s was often violent work. Companies hired thugs to scare organizers. They fired workers they thought liked the union. They broke strikes with people who would work anyway and hired muscle. Jimmy Hoffa fought back. He brought in tough guys who could stand up to the company thugs. He learned to use threats himself. He made friendships with people who could give him muscle when needed, people connected to organized crime. This is very important to understanding Jimmy Hoffa. He was not naive about the mob. He knew exactly who he was dealing with. But from his point of view, in the brutal world of labor organizing, you used whatever tools you had. If the companies used violence, you needed to be able to fight back. If that meant working with organized crime people, then that's what you did. His way worked. Membership in Teamsters Local 299 grew. Jimmy's reputation as an effective, fearless organizer spread. By the late 1930s, he was becoming an important person in Detroit's labor movement. Jimmy Hoffa's rise through the Teamsters leadership was marked by both real organizing skill and smart ruthlessness. During World War II, While many men were in the military, Jimmy kept up his organizing work, building the Union's power during a time when labor peace was thought of as a patriotic duty. After the war, as the economy boomed and trucking became more and more central to American business, the Teamsters' power grew like crazy. Jimmy became president of Local 299 in 1946. He was 33 years old, already a powerful figure in Detroit labor politics. He was short, about 5 feet 5, but built strong, with a fighting personality and an intense, focused energy. People who met him said they felt the force of his personality right away. He took over rooms through pure willpower. He was also getting a reputation for corruption. The line between real union activities and criminal businesses was getting fuzzy. Jimmy used union money for personal things. He was openly friends with known gangsters. He used threats and violence to get rid of rivals inside the union and to force businesses that did not want to recognize the Teamsters. But to his members, Jimmy Hoffa was a hero. He talked for better wages, better benefits, better working conditions. Under his leadership, truck drivers went from very low pay to middle-class salaries. They got pensions, health insurance, job security. For workers who remembered the desperate days of the Depression, Jimmy Hoffa had brought them the American dream. In 1952, Jimmy was elected vice president of the International Union. This was a step to the final prize, the presidency of the whole International Brotherhood of Teamsters. To get that goal, he would need to build teams, get rid of rivals, and most importantly, make sure of the support of the organized crime people who controlled key locals across the country. This is where Russell Bufalino and the mob's Teamsters plan became very important. By the 1950s, the friendship between Jimmy Hoffa and organized crime had changed from sometimes working together to a systematic partnership. Many crime families had interests in different Teamsters locals. To become president, Jimmy needed their support. The gangster bosses saw in Jimmy someone who understood the realities of power. He was not too sensitive about corruption. He was willing to make deals, and crucially, he had the real loyalty of the regular members. This gave him a legitimacy that purely mob-controlled union leaders did not have. A number of meetings happened in the early 1950s between Jimmy and different mob leaders, including Russell Bufalino. The deal was simple. The mob would support Jimmy's rise to the presidency. In return, Jimmy would give them access to the union's growing money and pension funds. For Russell Bufalino specifically, Jimmy meant the final useful thing. Through his cousin William Bufalino, who worked as a Teamsters lawyer, Russell had a direct line to Hoffa. When Russell needed a favor or loan from the pension fund, help with a labor problem, the hiring of a certain person, Jimmy would take care of it. And when Jimmy needed something muscle for a strike, help getting rid of a rival, protection from the police, Russell and the other mob bosses would give it. It was a friendship that helped both sides, built on helping each other and having power over each other. Neither could fully trust the other, but each needed what the other gave. In October 1957, Jimmy Hoffa was elected president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. At 44 years old, he had reached the top of American labor power. The Teamsters had grown to over 5 million members, making it the biggest and most powerful union in the United States, and Jimmy controlled it completely. His way of leading was like a dictator, but effective. He brought power to the center, making sure big decisions went through him personally. He traveled all the time, visiting locals, meeting with members, talking over contracts. He never got tired, often working 18-hour days, driven by an almost crazy energy. He talked for the National Master Freight Agreement, This made wages and conditions the same for long-distance truckers across the country. This was a really impressive thing to do. It made uniform rules across an industry that had been broken into hundreds of local agreements. For truck drivers, it meant better pay and things being predictable. But the corruption kept going and got bigger. The Teamster Central States Pension Fund, which held the retirement savings of hundreds of thousands of workers, became basically a mob bank. Loans were made to Las Vegas casinos, to businesses controlled by gangsters, often without good collateral or a real idea they would be paid back. Millions of dollars were taken or put into projects that helped gangsters rather than the workers whose money it was. Jimmy himself lived in a modest way. He never showed off money the way some corrupt union leaders did. But he used union resources like his personal money pot. He had union money pay for his houses, his travel, his legal fees. And he more and more surrounded himself with mob helpers and corrupt union officials who were loyal to him personally rather than to the union's members. Jimmy Hoffa's biggest enemy appeared in 1957, Robert F. Kennedy. He was then the chief lawyer for the Senate Select Committee on Improper Activities in Labor and Management. It was known as the McClellan Committee. Robert Kennedy, or Bobby, as everyone called him, was the younger brother of Senator John F. Kennedy. Bobby was a crusader, a moralist, someone who saw the world in clear terms of right and wrong, and when he looked at the Teamsters, what he saw shocked him. Corruption on a huge scale, millions of workers' dollars being stolen, systematic working together between union leaders and organized crime. And at the center of it all, Jimmy Hoffa, the McClellan Committee hearings, which went from 1957 to 1960, became a public show. Bobby Kennedy, as chief lawyer, led the questioning. Jimmy Hoffa came before the committee many times. He was defiant and fighting. The two men developed a strong mutual hate. Watching the film from these hearings is interesting. Bobby Kennedy, thin and intense, leaning forward as he asks questions, his Boston accent making his words short. Jimmy Hoffa, broad-shouldered and ready to fight, answering questions with barely hidden, using the Fifth Amendment when needed, never backing down. Mr. Hoffa, do you know Tony Provenzano? I know a lot of people. I'm asking about Anthony Provenzano specifically. Is he a member of your union? I'd have to check the records, Mr. Hoffa. Tony Provenzano is the president of Teamsters, Local 560 in New Jersey. Are you telling this committee you don't know one of your own local presidents? I said I'd have to check the records. It went on like this for hours, for days, over many sessions. Bobby Kennedy trying to trap Jimmy in lies or admissions. Jimmy Hoffa blocking, turning the question, never giving an inch. The hearings showed shocking facts. Teamsters officials living in luxury while workers struggled. Pension fund loans to known gangsters. Violence against people in the union who disagreed. A pattern of corruption so wide that it seemed to touch every level of the organization. But Jimmy could not be broken. He had excellent lawyers. Led by Edward Bennett Williams, one of the best criminal defense lawyers in America. He had the loyalty of the regular members, who saw the hearings as an attack on their union. And he had the protection of the mob, which had too much invested in him to let him fall. When John F. Kennedy was elected president in November 1960, he made his brother Bobby the Attorney General. Bobby Kennedy now had all the resources of the Department of Justice behind him, and he had one target above all others, Jimmy Hoffa. From 1961 to 1964, the Department of Justice under Bobby Kennedy's direction started what was like a personal crusade against Jimmy Hoffa. A special unit was made inside the Justice Department just to look into and take to court Hoffa. Agents followed him all the time. His phones were tapped. His friends were pushed to turn on him. Jimmy called it a personal attack, and he was not completely wrong. Bobby Kennedy's chasing of Hoffa was relentless to the point of obsession. He wanted Jimmy in prison, and he was willing to use every legal tool to make it happen. The first tries failed. Jimmy was tried for bribery and for fraud. But his lawyers were too good, and juries in Detroit, where Jimmy was seen as a local hero, would not find him guilty. In one case, proof came out that Jimmy had tried to bribe a jury, but even that case ended with the jury not agreeing. Finally, in 1964, the government succeeded. Jimmy was found guilty in 2 separate trials, one for jury tampering in the earlier bribery case, and another for fraud involving the wrong use of pension fund money. On March 7, 1967, after using up all his appeals, Jimmy Hoffa reported to Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania to start serving a 13-year sentence. He was 54 years old. He had been president of the Teamsters for 10 years, one of the most powerful men in America. Now he was inmate number 33298NE. But Jimmy Hoffa was not a man who accepted defeat easily. Even from prison, he kept using influence over the Teamsters. He refused to quit the presidency. Instead, he put in Frank Fitzsimmons, a loyal man under him, as acting president. It was understood that Frank was keeping the seat warm until Jimmy could return. And Jimmy was determined to return. He had powerful friends, including organized crime bosses who needed him back in power. He started planning for an early release, using every connection he had, reaching out to politicians who owed him favors. What Jimmy did not understand was that the world had moved on without him. The Teamsters under Frank Fitzsimmons was proving to be even more useful to the mob than under Jimmy. Frank was weaker, more bendable, easier to control. He did not have Jimmy's ego or his need to be the one in charge. The mob bosses were finding out that they liked having Frank Fitzsimmons as president better than Jimmy Hoffa. And that understanding, when Jimmy finally came to see it, would decide his fate. The connection between Frank Sheeran and Jimmy Hoffa was made easy by Russell Bufalino, but it grew into something more complicated than a simple mob job. To understand what happened in July 1975, we need to understand the friendship between these two men, how Frank went from being Russell's enforcer to becoming one of Jimmy's closest friends, and, as the story says, a man who would kill him. The introduction happened in the middle 1950s, around 1955 or 1956. Russell Bufalino arranged for Frank to meet Jimmy at a union meeting. Russell's reason was straightforward. Jimmy needed reliable muscle for different Teamsters operations, and Frank was someone Russell could speak for, a tough guy, a war veteran, someone who could handle himself and would not break under pressure. Jimmy and Frank liked each other right away. Even with their differences, Jimmy was short, intense, always moving. Frank was tall, calm, methodical. They connected on some level. Both were working-class guys who had fought their way up. Both understood violence not as something scary, but as a tool, a way to get something. Both were completely loyal to their bosses and expected that loyalty to be given back. Frank officially became a business agent for Teamsters Local 326 in Wilmington, Delaware. This was a common arrangement. The union would put mob helpers on the payroll in fake jobs that gave them real income and a cover for their actual activities. Frank's real job was being Jimmy Hoffa's problem solver. What exactly did Frank Sheeran do for Jimmy Hoffa? From Frank's later confession to Charles Brandt, and backed up somewhat by FBI files and stories from other sources. Frank's work fell into a few groups, scaring people in the Union who disagreed. The Teamsters, like any organization, had inside opposition, members who questioned Jimmy's leadership, rival officials who wanted to challenge him, people who wanted reform and objected to the corruption. Frank would visit these people and explain in very clear words the good things about keeping quiet and the results of causing problems. Sometimes words were enough. Sometimes a beating was needed. The message was always clear: do not challenge Jimmy Hoffa. Making sure strikes worked. When Teamsters went on strike, not everyone honored the picket line. Some drivers, desperate for money, would try to cross. Some companies would hire people to work anyway. Frank's job was to make sure strikes stayed solid, breaking windshields of trucks that tried to move goods, beating drivers who crossed picket lines, sometimes setting fire to places that refused to talk, collecting debts and making people pay. Jimmy had many loans out to different businesses and people. Some were real, some were connected to pension fund fraud. When payments were not made, Frank would pay a visit. Given his physical presence and reputation, he rarely needed to use violence. The threat was usually enough. Protection. As Jimmy's profile grew and his enemies got more numerous, he needed security. Frank worked as a bodyguard, traveling with Jimmy, going to meetings, always watching, always ready. This role gave Frank access to Jimmy's inner circle, to talks and decisions that few others were part of. But from Frank's confession, he did more than scare people and collect debts. He claimed to have done murders for Jimmy. Most famously, he claimed to have killed Joe Gallo, a New York gangster, in 1972 at Umberto's Clam House in Little Italy. This claim is argued about. Others confessed to or were suspected of the Gallo hit, but it shows the level of violence Frank claimed to have been part of. What is not argued about is that Frank Sheeran was one of Jimmy Hoffa's most trusted friends during the important years of Jimmy's power. He was part of the inner circle. There at important meetings, trusted with sensitive jobs. But Frank Sheeran had a problem that would become more and more sharp. He worked for Jimmy Hoffa, but he belonged to Russell Bufalino. This double loyalty was okay when Jimmy and the mob bosses were on the same side, when Jimmy was useful to organized crime, and they were useful to him. But as the 1960s went on, cracks started to appear in that alliance. Jimmy Hoffa, for all his corruption, was proud. He saw himself as a real union leader who happened to work with the mob, not as a mob puppet. He made decisions based on what he thought was best for his power and for the union. He did not always talk with the mob bosses before taking action. This independence worried Russell Bufalino and other mob leaders. They had invested in Jimmy, supported his rise, given him access to their resources. They expected thanks, conversation, respect. When Jimmy went to prison in 1967, some in the mob actually saw it as a chance to put in someone more controllable as the Teamsters president. Frank Sheeran, stuck in the middle, tried to keep loyalty to both men. But as any student of organized crime knows, double loyalty is not stable in the end. When interests go different ways, a choice must be made. Jimmy Hoffa's time in Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary was not normal for a prisoner connected to the mob. Usually, organized crime people serving time had it fairly easy. Guards who could be bribed, special privileges, keeping their criminal operations going from inside. Jimmy expected the same treatment. He did not get it. The Kennedy Justice Department had made sure Jimmy would serve hard time. No special privileges, no soft treatment. He was treated like any other prisoner, and it made him very angry. But Jimmy did not let being in prison break him. He worked in the prison laundry. He exercised all the time, keeping in shape. He read a lot biographies, history, anything he could get. And he planned constantly about his return to power. Frank Sheeran visited Jimmy regularly in prison. These visits were watched, conversations recorded, so they had to speak carefully. But Frank brought messages from the outside, updates on what was happening with the Teamsters, promises from Russell that work was being done to get Jimmy out early. What Frank did not tell Jimmy, maybe because he did not fully understand it himself yet, was how things were changing on the outside. Frank Fitzsimmons, the acting president, was proving popular with the mob bosses. Frank was easy to control, willing to approve loans and favors without asking too many questions. The pension fund was easier to get to than ever for mob plans. By 1970, some mob bosses were actively working to keep Jimmy in prison. They wanted Frank Fitzsimmons to stay president. They saw Jimmy as a possible problem if he returned too independent, too proud, too likely to try to take back control in ways that might mess up their profitable arrangements. Russell Bufalino was in a hard spot. He had a long friendship with Jimmy, and Russell valued loyalty. But he also saw the practical reality. Keeping Jimmy in prison might be better for business. Still, Russell kept supporting tries to get Jimmy released, maybe out of real loyalty, maybe to keep up appearances, maybe not putting all his eggs in one basket. On December 23, 1971, President Richard Nixon lessened Jimmy Hoffa's sentence. After 4 years and 9 months in prison, Jimmy walked out of Lewisburg a free man. But there was a catch, a big one. The lessening came with a condition. Jimmy Hoffa was not allowed to hold any union office or be part of union management until March 1980. That was the date his original sentence would have ended. Jimmy was outraged. The rule meant he could not take back the Teamsters presidency. He could not officially be part of union activities. He was being forced into retirement at age 58. Still strong, still hungry for power, Jimmy believed, and many investigators and history experts suspect, that the mob, particularly through Fitzsimmons and people like Anthony Provenzano, had influenced this condition to keep him on the side. They wanted him out of prison to satisfy what they owed him, but they did not want him back in power. Frank Fitzsimmons had proven too useful. Jimmy immediately started trying to get rid of the rule. He hired lawyers. He looked for political support. He filed appeals. He was determined to return to the Teamsters presidency, rule or not. And this is where the situation became dangerous for Jimmy Hoffa, because now his interests and the mob's interests were directly against each other. He wanted back in. They wanted him out. He was pushing for something they had clearly worked to stop. Frank Sheeran watched this growing fight with more and more worry. Jimmy was his friend, or as close to a friend as someone in their world could have. But Russell Bufalino was his boss, his patron, the man he owed everything to. And Russell was making it more and more clear that Jimmy's campaign to return to the Teamsters presidency was a problem. By 1975, Jimmy Hoffa had become what the mob thought of as a problem. He was talking too much to too many people, including maybe to the police. He was making threats, suggesting that if the mob did not support him, he might tell what he knew about their operations. He was being careless in his desperation to take back power, and in the world of organized crime, carelessness gets you killed. By July 1975, the situation had reached a breaking point. Jimmy Hoffa was more and more alone, and more desperate. His campaign to get rid of the rule on his union activities was failing. The Teamsters under Frank Fitzsimmons showed no sign of welcoming him back. Old friends were avoiding his calls. The mob bosses he had worked with for many years were no longer taking his meetings. Jimmy had been meeting with writers, giving interviews, talking about writing a book. This scared the mob leadership. What would Jimmy tell in such a book? How many secrets would he let out? He claimed he was only going to write about his real activities, but the mob bosses did not trust him. They knew too much, and Jimmy knew what they knew. There was talk that Jimmy was working with federal investigators, or thinking about working with them. This was probably not true. Jimmy's code would not have allowed him to become an informant. But in the mob, the look of disloyalty is as dangerous as real disloyalty. Suspicion is enough. Anthony Tony Provenzano had become a special focus of tension. Tony Pro was a mob-connected Teamsters official from New Jersey. He was linked to the Genovese crime family. He and Jimmy had been friends once, but they had had a fight when both were in Lewisburg prison. The fight was personal, some disrespect, some insult. The kind of small argument that in normal life would be solved or forgotten, but in the mob world could become deadly. After they were let out, the two men had been fighting. Jimmy had made threats against Tony Pro. Tony Pro had made threats against Jimmy. The mob leadership tried to make peace between them, but Jimmy refused to back down. He would not say sorry, would not let it go. This stubbornness, this refusal to bend, was classic Jimmy Hoffa. It was also suicidal. By July 1975, from later FBI analysis and informant reports, a decision had been made at the highest levels of the mob. Jimmy Hoffa had to go. He was too dangerous to leave alive. The question was not whether to kill him, but how to do it without starting a war inside the Teamsters or getting too much police attention. They needed someone Jimmy trusted absolutely, someone who could get close to him, someone who could bring him to his death without him suspecting. They needed Frank Sheeran. Wednesday, July 30th, 1975. Started like most days for Jimmy Hoffa. He woke up early at his home in Lake Orion, Michigan, a suburb northwest of Detroit. He had breakfast with his wife, Josephine. He had married her in 1936. They had been together for nearly 40 years. Through all the battles, the wins, the prison term, everything. Jimmy told Josephine he had a meeting planned for that afternoon at the Machu's Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, a rich suburb north of Detroit. He was supposed to meet with Anthony Tony Provenzano and Anthony Tony Giacalone. Giacalone was a powerful Detroit mob figure. The meeting, Jimmy said, was to settle the fight with Tony Pro. Giacalone was going to help them talk it out, help them work out their differences. This was good. Exactly the kind of solution the mob would want, and exactly what Jimmy needed if he was going to have any hope of returning to the Teamsters. Josephine did not like it. She had bad feelings about the meeting, though she could not say why. But Jimmy was determined. This was his chance to make peace, to show he was reasonable, to start rebuilding the alliances he needed. At about 2:15 p.m., Jimmy drove his wife's 1974 Pontiac Granville to the Machu's Red Fox. His own car was being fixed. It was a popular restaurant, nice, the kind of place where business people met for lunch, safe, public, nothing to worry about. The parking lot had several other cars, and some people who would later be talked to a lot by the FBI. Jimmy parked and waited from what people said. Jimmy was seen in the parking lot, making phone calls from a payphone. This was 1975, before cell phones. He looked agitated, checking his watch, walking back and forth. The men he was supposed to meet were not showing up. At 2:30 p.m., Jimmy called his wife. He told her Tony Pro and Tony Jack had not arrived yet. He was annoyed, but not worried. He said he would wait a bit longer and then head home. At 2:45 p.m., Jimmy called his friend Louis Linteau, a business friend from the same pay phone. He told Linteau the same thing. His meeting had not shown up. He was about to leave. That was the last sure talk anyone had with Jimmy Hoffa. At some time between 2:45 p.m. and 3 o'clock p.m., Jimmy Hoffa left the Match's Red Fox parking lot. Many people, including a truck driver who almost hit it, said they saw Jimmy get into a maroon 1975 Mercury Marquis with several men. A car later linked to Charles Chucky O'Brien, Hoffa's foster son and friend. People agreed. Jimmy got into the car willingly, apparently with people he knew and trusted. He was never seen alive again. From the confession Frank Sheeran gave to writer Charles Brandt, published in the book I Heard You Paint Houses. Here is what really happened that day, he says. Frank claims he was picked up earlier that day by two other mob helpers. They drove from Pennsylvania to Detroit. Frank was told what was going to happen. They were going to pick up Jimmy, take him to a house, and Frank was going to kill him. Frank says he was destroyed by this order. Jimmy was his friend. They had worked together for 20 years, but the order came from Russell Bufalino. And in Frank's world, when Russell gave an order, you followed it. No exceptions, no talking about it. They got to the Match's Red Fox around the time Jimmy was waiting. Frank says he was the one who went up to Jimmy in the parking lot. When Jimmy saw Frank, he relaxed. Frank was his guy, someone he trusted absolutely. Frank told Jimmy that Tony Pro and Tony Jack were at a nearby house, and they should go there for the meeting. Jimmy got in the car without a second thought. Why wouldn't he? Frank Sheeran had been his man for 2 decades. If Frank said it was safe, it was safe. They drove to a house in Detroit. Frank could not remember the exact address when he confessed years later, or said he could not. The house was empty. Arranged for this specific reason, they went inside. Jimmy was still not suspicious. Maybe he thought Tony Pro was running late, or that this was a more private place for their talk. They walked into the house. Jimmy in front, Frank behind. They went into a room. And according to Frank, in that moment, Frank pulled out a gun and shot Jimmy Hoffa twice in the back of the head. It was quick, Frank told Brandt. He didn't suffer. I didn't want him to suffer. Frank claims Jimmy died instantly. Falling to the floor, Frank says he did not look at Jimmy's face. Could not stand to see what he had done. The other men came in. They wrapped the body in a tarp, or carpet stories are different. They loaded it into a car. Frank says he does not know what happened to the body after that. He was not part of getting rid of it. That was handled by others. His job was done. Understanding the reason needs understanding the meaning of a few things. The Frank Fitzsimmons factor. By July 1975, Frank Fitzsimmons had proven much more bendable than Jimmy Hoffa ever was. Under Fitzsimmons, the mob had easy access to the pension fund. Loans were approved quickly, often without proper checking. The Teamsters under Fitzsimmons was basically a mob bank. Jimmy's return would end this arrangement. The fear of being found out. Jimmy was talking to journalists, to possible book partners, to anyone who would listen. He was angry, bitter, feeling betrayed. The mob worried that in his bitterness he might say too much. He knew where bodies were buried, both really and in secrets. He had been at meetings, knew about decisions, knew about operations covering many years. If he decided to work with the police, or even if he just wrote a book telling everything, the damage would be terrible. The Tony Pro problem. Anthony Provenzano wanted Jimmy dead for personal reasons. The prison fight had gotten worse. Tony Pro felt disrespected. In the mob, respect is everything. The mob leadership might have preferred to keep Jimmy alive, but on the side. But Tony Pro was pushing for a permanent solution. And Tony Pro had backing from the Genovese family, one of the most powerful crime families in America. The changing times. By 1975, the old mob was facing new pressures. The RICO laws were being made. Federal investigations were becoming smarter. The mob was becoming more careful, more closed. Jimmy Hoffa, loud and visible and unpredictable, did not fit this new reality. He was from an earlier time when mob leaders could be semi-public people. That time had passed, the point of no return. At some time, probably in late June or early July 1975, the mob leadership made the decision. A meeting was held, probably involving Russell Bufalino, Tony Provenzano, Tony Giacalone, and people from the major families. They talked about the Jimmy Hoffa problem. They decided he had to go. They planned how to do it. And they gave the job to the one man Jimmy would never suspect, Frank Sheeran. By 5 p.m. on July 30th, when Jimmy had not come home and was not answering calls, Josephine Hoffa knew something was very wrong. By that evening, she had contacted the police. By the next morning, a huge investigation was started. The FBI immediately suspected organized crime involvement. Jimmy's connections were well known. His recent fights with mob people were written down. The Bureau put together a group just to find Jimmy Hoffa. An investigation that would be called Hoffx. The investigation would become one of the biggest in FBI history. Hundreds of agents were given the job. Thousands of talks were done. Every part of Jimmy's life. Every known friend, every place he had been. Every phone call he had made. Everything was looked at, but they found nothing. No body, no murder weapon. No people who saw the actual crime. No one who would talk. The mob's code of omerta held strong. Everyone they talked to claimed they did not know. Tony Provenzano had an excuse for where he was. He was in New Jersey, confirmed by many people. Tony Giacalone had an excuse. He was at a spa, also confirmed. Russell Bufalino was in Pennsylvania. Nowhere near Detroit, Frank Sheeran was in Pennsylvania. Two, from his story, he had returned right after the killing, driving straight through. When FBI agents talked to him in the following days, he denied any knowledge of Jimmy's disappearance. He had not been in Detroit, he said. He had no idea what happened to Jimmy. He was shocked, sad about the disappearance of his friend. And the FBI could not prove otherwise. The agents suspected Frank. His name came up again and again in their investigation as someone close to both Jimmy and the mob. But suspicion is not proof. They had no people who could put Frank in Detroit that day. No science proof connecting him to the crime. Nothing they could use to charge him. The car Jimmy was said to be seen entering was never found. The house where Frank claimed the murder happened was never for sure found. And even if it had been, by the time Frank confessed many years later, any proof would have long been cleaned or destroyed. The body, the one piece of proof that might have solved everything, was never found. And without a body, without people who saw, without physical proof, the FBI could not make a case. The disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa started one of the biggest criminal investigations in American history. The FBI's Hoffx investigation used huge resources. At its highest point, over 200 agents were given the case, doing thousands of talks across many states. Why such a huge response? Partly because of who Jimmy was. Even with his criminal connections, he was a major American person. Past president of the nation's biggest union, someone who had been on the cover of Time magazine, who had faced senators and presidents, His disappearance was national news, catching public attention in a way normal mob hits did not. But there was more to it than public pressure. The FBI saw the Hoffa case as a chance to break open organized crime's control of the Teamsters. If they could solve the murder, they might be able to get someone to turn informant in exchange for a deal. That informant could then give proof about the bigger criminal business, about pension fund fraud, about corruption reaching the highest levels of the Union. So the FBI threw everything at the case. They wiretapped phones, watched suspected gangsters all the time, pushed lower-level criminals to talk, and followed up on every tip, no matter how silly it seemed. The search for Jimmy Hoffa's body became almost a legend, creating many years of guesses and countless false leads. Right after the disappearance, the FBI focused on places where a body could be quickly hidden. They searched fields near the Machu's Red Fox. They looked into building sites. There were stories Jimmy had been buried in concrete in different buildings or building projects. They followed tips about bodies thrown in rivers or lakes. Every few years, a new idea would come up, making headlines and new search tries. The Giant Stadium idea, maybe the most famous story, was that Jimmy's body was buried in concrete under the end zone at Giant Stadium in New Jersey, which was being built in 1975. This idea was so strong that it became part of popular culture, but no good proof ever supported it. And the stadium has since been torn down without any body being found. The Michigan farm. Many informants suggested Jimmy was buried on a farm in country Michigan. The FBI did big searches of several properties, using ground-penetrating radar and even digging up certain areas. Nothing was found. The mob rendering plant. One idea suggested Jimmy's body was taken to a mob-connected rendering plant where it was destroyed in equipment made to process animal bodies. This idea is possible. It would explain why no body was ever found. But it cannot be proven. The funeral home. Frank Sheeran's confession suggested the body was taken to a mob-connected funeral home and cremated. This would have been an effective way to get rid of proof. But again, by the time Frank confessed, any proof of such cremation would be long gone. Buried in Detroit. The most ordinary idea is that Jimmy was simply buried somewhere in the Detroit area. Maybe in a building site, under a building, or in a place that has since been built on. Detroit had many left-alone properties and areas in the 1970s where a body could be hidden. The FBI's inability to find the body frustrated investigators and interested the public. In mob cases, bodies usually turn up in the end. Killers make mistakes. People who saw come forward. Someone talks, but in Jimmy's case, the getting rid of the body was handled like a professional. Whoever did it knew what they were doing over the years. Many informants gave information about the Hoffa killing. The problem was that much of this information did not match, was not complete, or could not be checked. Ralph Picardo was a mob-connected criminal who in the late 1970s told the FBI that Jimmy was killed by a hit to the head with a wrench. Then the body was gotten rid of through a meat processing plant. Picardo gave specific details, but investigators could not back up his story. Donald Tony the Greek Frankos was a hitman who claimed in the 1980s that he was part of Jimmy's murder and that the body was gotten rid of in a New Jersey landfill. His story was very different from other informants, and he was not thought reliable. Richard the Iceman Kuklinski was a mob hitman who claimed before his death that he killed Jimmy Hoffa. But Kuklinski was known to make false claims about murders he did not do, and his Hoffa confession was not taken seriously by investigators. Charles Chucky O'Brien, Jimmy's foster son and longtime friend, was named by the FBI as likely part of the taking, maybe as the person who picked up Jimmy at the Notch's Red Fox. O'Brien denied this until his death, and he was never charged. The proof against him was based on circumstances but strong. The most believable information came not from people who confessed they did it, but from mob people who heard about the killing secondhand. Many informants, separately, told similar stories. Jimmy was killed by someone he trusted in a house in Detroit. On orders from the mob leadership, the body was immediately gotten rid of. Everyone involved was told to never speak of it. This same pattern across many sources gave investigators confidence that they understood the big outline of what happened, even if they could not prove it in court, even though no one was ever charged with Jimmy Hoffa's murder. The case did have legal results for some of the suspected people. Anthony Tony Provenzano, while never charged in the Hoffa case, Tony Pro was found guilty in 1978 of racketeering and the murder of another Teamsters official, Anthony Castellito. He died in prison in 1988. Anthony Tony Giacalone, also never charged in the Hoffa case. Giacalone kept running Detroit mob operations until he was put in prison on other charges. He died in 2001. Salvatore Sally Bugs Briguglio, widely suspected of being one of the actual shooters if Frank Sheeran's confession is false. Briguglio was killed in 1978 in what was likely a mob hit, maybe because he knew too much about the Hoffa murder. Russell Bufalino, found guilty of extortion in 1977. Russell died in prison in 1994, never having been charged in the Hoffa case. Even though he was widely suspected of ordering the hit. Frank Sheeran, never charged. Frank lived until 2003, keeping his innocence public while, according to Charles Brandt, confessing privately in his final years. In 1982, 7 years after his disappearance, Jimmy Hoffa was legally said to be dead. His family had a memorial service, but there was no closure, no grave to visit, no final resting place. Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance and believed murder had deep effects on the Teamsters Union. The Frank Fitzsimmons time. Frank Fitzsimmons stayed president until his death in 1981. Under his leadership, mob control of the union stayed huge. The pension fund kept being used basically as a mob bank, with loans going to Las Vegas casinos and other mob-connected businesses. The RICO court cases. In the 1980s, the Department of Justice started using RICO, racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations, laws to take to court whole criminal businesses, rather than just individual crimes. This led to big court cases of mob people connected to the Teamsters, slowly breaking the hold organized crime had on the Union. Federal watching. In 1988, the federal government brought a civil RICO case against the Teamsters leadership. This ended in an agreement that put the Union under federal watching. This watching, which continues in a changed way today, was made to get rid of corruption and mob influence, reform and getting better. Under federal watching, the Teamsters began a slow process of reform. Elections became more democratic. Money controls were made tighter. By the late 1990s and 2000s, the Union had largely, though not completely, freed itself from mob control. Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance became a symbol of everything wrong with the old Teamsters. The corruption, the violence, the mob connections. People in the Union who wanted reform used the case as a point to gather around for change. In a strange way, Jimmy's death did what his life never could. It broke the mob's hold on the Union he had built. The Jimmy Hoffa case caught America's imagination in a way few criminal cases do. It became a reference point in popular culture, a word for unsolved mysteries and mob violence. Books. Many books have been written about the case, each suggesting ideas about what happened. Charles Brandt's I Heard You Paint Houses is the most famous, but others have presented different suspects and different stories. Documentaries. Many documentaries have looked at the case, talking to investigators, gangsters, Teamsters officials, and family members. Each generation finds the story new films. Besides Scorsese's The Irishman, the Hoffa case has been shown in many films and TV shows. The 1992 film, Hoffa, starring Jack Nicholson, took big freedoms with the facts, but caught something of Jimmy's personality in the time. Comedy. The mystery of Jimmy Hoffa's burial place became a regular thing for comedians and comedy writers. References to Hoffa being buried under different landmarks became a short way to say unsolved mysteries. Why did this case catch such attention when many mob murders did not? Maybe because Jimmy, even with his corruption, was a truly important American person. Someone who shaped the labor movement, who fought senators and presidents, who stood for both the promise and the corruption of mid-century American labor. Maybe because the mystery itself, the lack of a body, the ideas that don't match, the code of silence that held for many years stood for something basic about organized crime's power and American law enforcement's limits. Or maybe because Jimmy's story is, in its way, a very American tragedy. The working-class kid who fought his way to the top, who got real power, who helped his members get the American dream, but who made deals with the devil, and in the end paid the price. To really understand the world that made the Jimmy Hoffa murder, we need to understand the other major people in this story. The mob bosses, the enforcers, the different characters who filled this dark corner of American history. Martin Scorsese's film, The Irishman, brought many of these people to the screen. Some accurately, others with big changes for the movie. Let's look at the real men behind the characters. Angelo Bruno, shown in the film by Harvey Keitel, was one of the most successful mob bosses in American history, exactly because he understood the value of holding back. He was born Angelo Annaloro in Sicily in 1910. He came to Philadelphia as a child. By the 1950s, he had risen to become boss of the Philadelphia crime family, a job he held for an amazing 21 years, from 1959 until his death in 1980. Bruno's nickname, the Gentle Don, was not a joke. He really preferred talking to violence. He believed that too much violence got the police's attention and messed up business. Under his leadership, Philadelphia's mob was very peaceful. Few inside power fights, few public murders, steady profits from the usual rackets. Bruno controlled the usual businesses: gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, but he was smart about growing. When other families rushed into drug moving in the 1970s, Bruno was careful, seeing that drugs got federal attention that the usual rackets did not. This carefulness kept him out of prison during a time when many mob bosses were being found guilty. His friendship with Russell Bufalino was close and helped both. The two men controlled next to each other areas and worked together rather than competed. When Bruno needed support on the commission, Russell gave it. When Russell needed connections in Philadelphia, Bruno made them happen. Bruno's rule ended violently on March 21, 1980, when he was shot with a shotgun while sitting in his car outside his home in South Philadelphia. His murder was the start of a brutal mob war in Philadelphia that killed many and basically destroyed the family's power. The killers were members of his own organization who wanted to follow more aggressive plans, especially in drug moving and Atlantic City casino operations. The irony is sharp. Bruno's carefulness in holding back kept him safe and successful for 21 years. But it also made younger, more ambitious members of his family angry. They wanted money faster and were willing to take bigger risks. His murder showed that even in the mob, being moderate can be dangerous when others want to push harder. Carlo Gambino, who appears briefly in The Irishman, was maybe the most powerful mob boss in America during the late 1960s and 1970s. Born in Sicily in 1902, Gambino came to America illegally in 1921. Jumping off a ship in Norfolk, Virginia, he made his way to Brooklyn, where he joined the mob organization that would finally have his name. He was patient, smart, and absolutely ruthless when needed. Gambino rose to become boss of what was then called the Anastasia family. In 1957, after Albert Anastasia was murdered in a Manhattan barbershop hit Gambino likely helped plan, he renamed it the Gambino family. Under his leadership, it became the largest and most money-making crime family in America. By the 1970s, the Gambino family had about 300 made members and thousands of helpers. It controlled labor racketeering operations in New York's building industry, the Fulton Fish Market, garbage collection, and many other areas. The family made hundreds of millions of dollars every year. Gambino himself was very successful at avoiding being taken to court. He was arrested sometimes, but rarely found guilty. He understood the importance of distance, keeping layers of men under him between himself and actual criminal acts, never speaking directly about crimes where he might be recorded. His friendship with Russell Bufalino was respectful and cooperative. When the commission needed to make decisions about the Teamsters or about Jimmy Hoffa, Gambino's opinion had huge weight. His support for getting rid of Hoffa was likely very important to that decision being made. Gambino died of natural causes in 1976 at age 74. He was one of the few mob bosses of his time to die in his bed rather than in prison or by violence. His funeral in Brooklyn was attended by thousands, a sign of his status not just in the criminal world, but in the Italian-American community. His legacy was the Gambino family itself, which under bosses after him stayed the most powerful crime family in New York through the 1980s and 1990s. It took many years of federal RICO court cases to really weaken the organization he built. Anthony "Fat Tony" Salerno, shown in a memorable way in The Irishman, was a high member of the Genovese crime family. During the 1970s and 1980s, he was one of the most seen mob people in America. Born in East Harlem in 1911, Salerno rose through the Genovese family, ranks through a mix of criminal skill and political ability. He made his money mainly through illegal gambling and loan sharking operations in Harlem and East Harlem, area he controlled for many years. By the 1970s, Fat Tony was the front boss of the Genovese family. This means he looked like the boss, while the real boss, Vincent the Chin Gigante, pretended to be mentally not right to avoid being taken to court. This setup made Fat Tony the public face of the family, the man who went to commission meetings, who was photographed by people watching, who took the heat. Fat Tony worked from the Palma Boy Social Club on East 115th Street in East Harlem, where he held court every day. He met with helpers, talked business, and kept up the public image of a neighborhood character rather than a violent criminal. His look backed up this image, heavy set, hence the nickname. Usually in casual clothes, smoking cigars, he looked more like someone's uncle than a ruthless mob leader. But under the friendly outside was a man responsible for many murders and criminal operations that made millions of dollars. Fat Tony's involvement in the Hoffa case, if any, would have been indirect. As a commission member or high Genovese person, he likely was asked about or told of the decision to kill Jimmy. Anthony Provenzano, one of the key people in Hoffa's murder, was a member of the Genovese family, meaning Fat Tony would have had some watching, or at least knowledge of Tony Pro's activities. Fat Tony's luck ended in 1986 when he was found guilty in the famous commission case. That was the federal RICO court case that targeted the leadership of New York's 5 families at the same time. He was sentenced to 100 years in prison and died in 1992 while locked up, still saying he was just a neighborhood guy who played cards. Joe Gallo is an interesting person in mob history. Someone whose big personality and violent ambitions made him both legendary and doomed. Born in Brooklyn in 1929, Joey Gallo was a different generation from most of the gangsters in our story. Younger, wilder, less respectful of the old ways. He and his brothers Larry and Albert, Kid Blast, ran a crew that worked in Brooklyn. They were involved in forcing money, hijacking, and killings for hire. Joey got his nickname, Crazy Joe, through a mix of real recklessness and done-on-purpose performance. He would do things other gangsters would not. Kill people in the middle of the day, challenge more powerful bosses, ignore orders he did not agree with. Part of this was real impulsiveness, but part was strategy. Being known as crazy meant people were afraid to face you. In the early 1960s, the Gallo brothers went to war with Joe Profaci, boss of what would become the Colombo family. The Gallo wars were brutal, many murders, constant tension. In the end, a peace made by the commission. The Gallos lost. Joe Gallo was put in prison in 1961 for forcing money. While in prison, Joe changed himself. He read a lot: philosophy, literature, politics. He became friends with African American prisoners and, very unusually for an Italian gangster of that time, made real friendships across racial lines. When he was let out in 1971, he brought African American helpers into his crew, breaking one of the mob's long-standing color lines. Joe also made friendships with famous people, artists and journalists. He liked the attention, the glamour of being a famous gangster in a time when mob people were becoming cultural icons. He dated the actress Senna Esseri, whom he finally married, but fame did not protect him. On April 7, 1972, Joe Gallo was murdered at Umberto's Clam House in Little Italy while celebrating his birthday with family and friends. Gunmen rushed in and shot him many times. He died in the street outside. Who killed Joe Gallo stays officially unsolved. The main idea is that it was ordered by the Colombo family in payback for Joe's earlier attack on Joe Colombo, who was shot at an Italian-American rally in 1971 and left in a state where he could not think. Frank Sheeran claimed he was the shooter, but this claim is argued about. Other gangsters and investigators believe it was members of the Colombo family. Gallo's story shows the danger of being too visible, too ambitious, too willing to challenge the way things are. The mob values being quiet and obeying. Joe Gallo valued neither, and it cost him his life at age 43. Salvatore Briguglio is one of the most important and least famous people in the Hoffa case. If Frank Sheeran did not kill Jimmy Hoffa, and many investigators believe he did not, then Sally Bugs probably did. Born in New Jersey in 1930, Briguglio was a member of Anthony Provenzano's crew in Teamsters Local 560. Sally Bugs was an enforcer, a violence expert, someone who did the dirty work that kept Tony Pro in power. He got his nickname from his eyes. They bulged a little, giving him a distinctive, unsettling look. By all stories, Sally Bugs was very dangerous. A professional criminal who handled murders with a workmanlike way. By 1975, Sally Bugs was deeply part of Tony Pro's operations. when the decision was made to kill Jimmy Hoffa. Sally Bugs was a natural choice to be part of it. Many FBI informants named him as likely there at the murder, maybe as one of the shooters. The FBI built a case based on circumstances against Sally Bugs for the Hoffa murder. They had people who put him in Detroit around the time of the killing. They had informant reports describing his involvement. They had proof connecting him to people and places important to the crime, but they could not prove it. Sally Bugs refused to talk, keeping the Omerta Code. Without his cooperation, or a body, or physical proof, the people taking to court could not charge him. On March 21, 1978, Salvatore Briguglio was shot many times on a street in Little Italy, Manhattan. He died almost instantly. He was 47 years old. The timing is important. Just as the people taking to court were getting closer to charging him for the Hoffa murder, just as pressure was building for someone to term informant, Sally Bugs was gotten rid of. The main idea is that he was killed by the mob to stop him from talking. To close off a possible way of investigation, his murder mirrors a pattern seen again and again in the Hoffa case. Anyone who knew too much, anyone who might break under pressure, was systematically gotten rid of. The mob was protecting its secret with a ruthlessness that even by mob standards was extreme. Charles Chucky O'Brien has a unique and sad place in the Hoffa story. He was Jimmy's foster son, raised by the Hoffa family after his mother became involved with Jimmy. Jimmy treated Chucky like a son, taught him, brought him into the Teamsters. But by 1975, Chucky's loyalty had changed. Or so the FBI believed. Chucky was deeply in debt, financially desperate, easy to mob pressure. When the mob needed someone to trick Jimmy to his death, someone Jimmy would trust absolutely, they turned to Chucky. The FBI's idea was that Chucky picked up Jimmy at the Macho's Red Fox, telling him that Tony Pro and Tony Jack were waiting at a nearby house. Jimmy, trusting his foster son completely, got in the car. Chucky drove him to the house where he was killed. Chucky denied this story until his death in 2020. He insisted he was not involved, that he did not betray Jimmy, that the FBI was wrong. But the proof against him was big, if based on circumstances, his car. A maroon Mercury, borrowed from a mob-connected friend, matched what people said of the car Jimmy was seen entering. Dogs trained to find dead bodies smelled human remains in the car's back seat. Chucky's excuse for where he was shaky and changed over time. If Chucky did betray Jimmy, the psychological weight of that betrayal must have been crushing. To kill your father figure, even indirectly, even under pressure, is a weight few could bear. Chucky spent the rest of his life insisting on his innocence, writing a book defending himself, desperately trying to convince people he was not the betrayer in this story. Whether he was or was not stays argued about, but the FBI believed it, and that belief was based on big proof. Even if not enough to take to court, the Hoffa case involved many other mob people, each playing smaller but important roles. Gabriel Briguglio, Sally Bugs' brother, also likely involved in the actual murder, also killed in 1980. Another loose end tied up, Stephen Andretta, another member of Tony Pro's crew, suspected of being part of the murder, died before he could be taken to court. Thomas Andretta, Stephen's brother, also suspected, also escaped being taken to court, and many more. Each of these men was part of the complicated web of friendships that made the Hoffa murder possible, the system of organized crime that could plan, do, and cover up a murder so completely that 50 years later, it stays officially unsolved. The story that became The Irishman started not with Martin Scorsese, but with a former person who takes to court turned defense lawyer and writer named Charles Brandt. In the late 1990s, Brandt was approached by a man named Frank Sheeran who wanted to talk. Frank was old, dying of cancer, and after a lifetime of silence, he had decided to confess. He wanted to tell the truth about what he had done, about his life in the mob, about the crimes he had done. Most importantly, he wanted to confess to killing Jimmy Hoffa. Brandt was doubtful at first. Many people over the years had claimed involvement in the Hoffa killing. Most were lying, looking for attention, or trying to make their criminal past sound bigger. But as Brandt talked to Frank over many times, he became convinced that Frank was telling the truth, or at least what Frank believed to be the truth. The resulting book, I Heard You Paint Houses, was published in 2004, shortly after Frank's death. The title came from the saying Russell Bufalino supposedly used when he first met Frank. I heard you paint houses, meaning, I heard you kill people. The answer, according to Frank, was, I do my own carpentry. 2, meaning I also clean up my own crime scenes. The book was gripping, a first-person story of mob life, of the Bufalino family, of the Teamsters' corruption, and of the most famous unsolved mystery in American crime. Brandt wrote it as Frank told it, in Frank's voice, making an intimate confessional story, but from the moment it was published, the book was argued about many people, including FBI agents who had worked the Hoffa case, were doubtful of Frank's claims. The question became, was Frank Sheeran really the man who killed Jimmy Hoffa? Or was this an old man's final trick, a grab at fame before death? Martin Scorsese, the famous director who had made his name with mob films like Goodfellas and Casino, read Brandt's book and was fascinated. Here was a story that connected many parts of American history. World War II, the labor movement, organized crime, political corruption, all filtered through the experience of one man. But it took years to get the film made. The project needed a huge budget. The de-aging technology alone, which would let Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, and Joe Pesci play their people across many years, was very expensive. Normal studios did not want the cost, especially for what was basically a 3.5-hour thinking about aging, loyalty, and regret, rather than a normal mob action film. Finally, Netflix agreed to pay for the film, giving Scorsese complete creative control and the budget he needed. Filming began in 2017. The cast was amazing. De Niro as Frank Sheeran, Pacino as Jimmy Hoffa, Pesci coming out of retirement as Russell Bufalino, plus many supporting actors playing real historical people. The film was released in 2019 to praise from critics. It was nominated for 10 Academy Awards, though it did not win any. But more importantly, it lit again public interest in the Hoffa case and brought Frank Sheeran's confession to a much bigger audience than the book had reached. The Irishman is very accurate in many ways, especially compared to normal Hollywood mob films. The historical timeline. The film carefully follows real events. The Appalachian Meeting of 1957, where many mob bosses were caught meeting at Joseph Barbara's estate in upstate New York. Jimmy's battles with Bobby Kennedy, the 1967 imprisonment, the 1971 release with rules, the 1975 disappearance, the characters. Many of the character shows are based on big research. Al Pacino's Jimmy Hoffa catches the real man's intensity, his working-class roots, his fighting personality, and his real belief in union power. Joe Pesci's Russell Bufalino wonderfully shows the quiet, understated style that made the real Russell so effective. The mob culture. The film accurately shows mob rules, the respect for bosses, the importance of permission before actions, the systematic corruption of unions, the casual violence under everything, the Teamsters operations. The film shows how the mob used the Teamsters for theft operations, how pension fund loans worked, how union positions were used as mob jobs, the friendships, the complicated friendship between Frank, Russell, and Jimmy is shown with subtlety. Frank's double loyalty, his real liking for both men, even with their opposing interests, sounds true to how such friendships really worked. The ending, the film's final part, showing Frank's old age, his being alone, his inability to fully explain the choices he made, is psychologically smart. Many former gangsters who lived into old age reported similar feelings, not quite regret, but a feeling of emptiness, of having paid a price that maybe was not worth what they got. But a film is not a documentary, and Scorsese took big freedoms with certain parts. The de-aging, obviously, using digital effects to make 76-year-old Robert De Niro look younger, is not real. But it serves the story's need to show Frank across 5 decades. Composite characters. Some characters in the film are mixes of many real people, putting together traits or actions to make the story simpler. Simplified timeline. Certain events are squeezed or put in a different order for dramatic effect. The film cannot include every meeting, every middle step in their friendships. The Hoffa killing. The film shows the murder largely as Frank described it, but presents it as sure fact when it stays argued about. Left out complications. The film does not fully look at other ideas about the Hoffa killing or how much Frank's confession was doubted by investigators. Family dynamics. Frank's friendship with his daughters is emphasized more than it likely was in reality, making emotional weight, but maybe exaggerating how much Frank was affected by their distance. The FBI, while never officially closing the case, has largely accepted Frank Sheeran's story as believable. In 2004, the case's lead investigator said that based on Frank's confession and backing up proof, they believed Frank was at least there at the murder, if not the actual shooter. But without more proof, without a body, without living people who saw willing to say in court, the case stays officially unsolved. Frank Sheeran was never charged, and no one else has been either. The time limit on federal murder charges does not exist. The case could, in theory, still be taken to court if proof came out. But with every passing year, as people who saw die and memories fade, being taken to court becomes less likely when looking at Frank Sheeran's confession. Science experts and investigators have looked at many parts of his story. Timeline analysis. Frank's claim that he drove from Pennsylvania to Detroit, killed Jimmy, and returned the same day is physically possible. The drive is about 550 miles, doable in 9 to 10 hours. Many people could have made the round trip within a 24-hour period without unusual trouble. The house. Frank claimed the murder happened in a house in northwest Detroit, but he could not give a specific address. Saying his memory had faded, this is convenient for someone lying, but also realistic for someone remembering events many years later. The FBI looked into several houses that matched Frank's general description, but never found sure proof at any of them. By the time Frank confessed, any physical proof would have long been cleaned or destroyed. The weapon. Frank claimed he used a gun, shooting Jimmy twice in the back of the head. This matches informant reports and the likely method. A gun would be quick and sure. Frank said he does not know what happened to the weapon, which is possible. Others would have handled getting rid of it. The body. Frank said he did not take part in getting rid of the body, that he was told to leave right after the shooting while others handled cleanup. This makes sense in how an operation works. The shooter's presence is not needed for getting rid of the body. and limiting knowledge keeps information in separate parts. Blood proof. In 2004, many years after the murder, FBI science teams searched a house in northwest Detroit that matched some of Frank's descriptions. They took up floorboards and found signs of human blood. First tests looked good, but DNA analysis for sure showed the blood was not Jimmy Hoffa's. This neither proves nor disproves Frank's story. The house might not have been the exact place, or the blood might be from another event, but no match was found. Several retired FBI agents who worked the Hoffa case have said publicly they believe Frank's confession. Their reasons include the ring. One detail involves a special gold Teamsters ring Hoffa supposedly loved. Frank claimed he took it from the body and gave it to Russell Bufalino's lawyer. Years later, the lawyer's widow reportedly confirmed her husband got a similar ring from a mob helper. Though she could not prove it was Hoffa's, this detail, not widely known publicly, gives some weight to believers, but stays unproven. The cremation detail. Frank said the body was taken to a funeral home connected to the mob and cremated. The FBI's investigation had found a specific funeral home in Detroit with mob ties that had cremation facilities. Informants had suggested this method of getting rid of the body was possible. Frank's story matches this independently developed idea. Consistency with known facts. While parts of Frank's story cannot be checked, nothing in his story directly goes against checked proof. The timeline works. The people involved make sense. The method is possible. His manner. Charles Brandt, who spent a lot of time with Frank, believed him. Brandt was a former person who takes to court, trained to find lies. He said Frank showed real feeling when talking about the killing, not guilt exactly, but a sense of loss, of having done something that cost him a lot. Lack of other confessions. Even with many false confessions over the years, Frank stays the most detailed and believable. If he were lying, why would his lie be so much more consistent and possible than others? The case against Frank's confession focuses on a few points. The proof gap. Even with FBI knowledge of Frank's likely involvement, they suspected him even before his confession. They never found proof putting him in Detroit. On July 30th, 1975, no phone records showing calls from Detroit. No people who saw him. No credit card receipts. No hotel records for someone supposedly making a 10-hour round-trip drive to do a murder. Frank left no trace. Physical condition. By 1975, Frank had important health problems. He had diabetes, heart issues, and other sicknesses. Some investigators question if he was physically able to do the murder he described. Other suspects more likely. The main FBI idea before. Frank's confession focused on Sally Bugs Briguglio and other members of Tony Pro's crew. These men had stronger reasons. They worked directly for Tony Pro, who wanted Jimmy dead. They had more direct involvement with the planning. They were in Detroit, and many informants named them specifically. The timing of the confession. Frank waited until he was dying to confess, and the confession was made to a writer, not to the police. This pattern matches someone looking for fame rather than really getting something off his chest. Many criminals who confess late in life do so for attention or to make their reputation sound bigger. Details that do not fit. Some specific claims in Frank's confession do not match known proof. For example, he described the setup of the house in ways that do not match houses the FBI looked into. He claimed certain people were there who may not have been in Detroit that day. The mob's code. Frank's confession breaks omerta, the code of silence. While dying gangsters sometimes break this code, it stays unusual. Russell Bufalino, Angelo Bruno, Carlo Gambino, These men never talked, never confessed, kept silence until death. That Frank would break ranks even near death strikes some as not matching his character. Putting together all available information, here is what we can say with reasonable confidence about what probably happened. On July 30th, 1975, Jimmy Hoffa was tricked to the Mashu's Red Fox restaurant by someone he trusted, possibly Chucky O'Brien, with the promise of a meeting to settle his differences with Tony Provenzano. Instead of going to the restaurant, he was taken, or drove himself, to a house in Detroit where he was killed. Most likely shot, his body was immediately gotten rid of, possibly through cremation at a mob-connected facility, possibly buried, possibly destroyed through other means. Many people were involved in the murder and getting rid of the body, including members of Tony Pro's crew and possibly Frank Sheeran. The killing was ordered at the highest levels of the mob, with Russell Bufalino, Anthony Giacalone, and others involved in the decision and planning. What is not sure? Who actually pulled the trigger? Was it Frank Sheeran, as he claimed? Was it Sally Bugs Briguglio, as many investigators believe? Was it someone else completely? We may never know for sure. The exact method of getting rid of the body also stays not sure, though cremation seems most likely given the complete absence of remains. What we know for sure, Jimmy Hoffa was murdered on July 30th, 1975, by organized crime people on orders from mob leadership because he had become a problem to their operations. The murder was planned carefully, done professionally, and covered up so completely that 50 years later, it stays officially unsolved. Everyone who knew the truth was either involved in the crime or too scared of mob payback to speak. Frank Sheeran died on December 14, 2003, at a place where older people live and get care in Philadelphia. He was 83 years old. His death came less than a year before Charles Brandt's book was published, meaning Frank never saw the public reaction to his confession, never had to face questions or challenges to his story. His daughters reportedly were there at his death, though his friendship with them had been hard for many years. In the final months of his life, according to Brandt, Frank seemed to be looking for some form of peace, if not being saved from sin. He said he was sorry, not for specific actions, but for how his life had turned out, for the being alone and emptiness he felt. His funeral was small. He had outlived most of his friends from the mob world. Russell Bufalino had died in 1994. Jimmy Hoffa had been gone for 28 years. The world Frank had lived in the working-class parts of Philadelphia, the mob-controlled Teamsters. The time when organized crime had huge power, that world had mostly disappeared. Frank Sheeran died as he had lived much of his life, quietly, without show, known to few outside the criminal underworld. It was only after his death, through Brandt's book and finally Scorsese's film, that he became famous. His name forever linked with the most famous unsolved mystery in American crime. The Jimmy Hoffa disappearance and the events around it marked a turning point in American organized crime's friendship with labor unions and with American society more broadly. It was the start of the end. By the late 1970s, the mob's control of the Teamsters, while still big, was starting to wear away. Federal people who take to court were making new tools, particularly RICO laws. That let them take to court whole criminal businesses, rather than just individual crimes. The Hoffa case, while never solved, showed that even powerful union leaders with mob connections could be gotten rid of. This, in turn, made people more willing to work with federal investigations. More federal watching. The publicity around Jimmy's disappearance put huge pressure on the Department of Justice to deal with mob corruption in the Teamsters. This led to many years of federal watching, court-ordered reforms, and finally the breaking of the mob's hold on the Union, the end of a time. The 1970s and 1980s saw the gradual fall of the traditional American mafia. Reasons included better police techniques, RICO court cases, the rise of other criminal organizations, particularly drug cartels, and population changes in Italian-American communities that meant fewer young men were joining the mob. The Hoffa case symbolized this fall, the old ways, where gangsters and union leaders openly worked together, where violence solved fights, where omerta was unbreakable. Those ways were ending. Union reform. The Teamsters, after many years of corruption, began a slow process of reform in the 1980s and 1990s. While corruption has not been completely gotten rid of, the systematic mob control that marked the Hoffa time is gone. The Union today, while still powerful, works much more openly and democratically than it did in Jimmy's time. It is important to say that even with his criminal connections and corrupt practices, Jimmy Hoffa got real, important benefits for American workers. A National Master Freight Agreement. This important contract made wages and conditions the same for truck drivers across the country, lifting hundreds of thousands of workers into the middle class. Before Jimmy, long-distance truck drivers were among the poorest workers in America. Under his leadership, they got good wages, benefits, and job security, pension and health benefits. The Teamsters Central States Pension Fund, even though it was robbed by gangsters, also gave real retirement security for hundreds of thousands of workers who otherwise would have had none. Health insurance, vacation pay, and other benefits talked for by Jimmy improved workers' lives a lot. Worker power. Jimmy understood that organized workers could demand dignity and fair treatment from employers, whatever his personal corruption. He really believed in union power and showed that workers standing together could achieve things that were impossible alone. System of labor organization. The Teamsters under Jimmy built an organizational system, union halls, training programs, legal services, political speaking for, that helped members no matter the corruption at the top. The tragedy of Jimmy Hoffa is that he could have been remembered as one of labor's great champions, a working-class hero who fought for his members and won them a better life. Instead, his criminal connections and corrupt practices stained his real achievements and finally led to his violent death. 50 years after Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance, the case keeps catching public attention. Why? The unsolved mystery. Humans are made to want an answer. An unsolved murder of someone famous goes against our sense of order. We want to know what happened, who did it, where the body is. The absence of answers keeps us interested. The larger-than-life people. Jimmy Hoffa, Russell Bufalino, Frank Sheeran. These were not ordinary people. They were people of real historical importance who worked where many powerful institutions met. Their stories have the quality of legend. The time period, the mid-20th century, was a special moment in American history. After war prosperity, rising Union power, the Kennedy time. Vietnam, social change. The Hoffa story touches all these themes. Class and power. At its heart, this is a story about power. How it is gotten, how it is kept, how it corrupts. It is about working-class people who got wealth and influence through both real organizing and criminal activity. It speaks to basic American tensions about class, chance, and corruption. The betrayal. If Frank Sheeran did kill Jimmy, it was the final betrayal. A trusted friend, almost a family member, murdering the man who had given him chance and respect. This Judas part rings deeply. Moral gray area. There are no simple heroes or bad guys here. Jimmy was corrupt, but got real benefits for workers. Frank was a killer, but showed real loyalty and followed his code. Russell was a crime boss, but worked with intelligence and holding back. This moral complexity makes the story more interesting than simple good versus bad stories. And so we reach the end of this trip through one of America's most lasting mysteries. We have followed Frank Sheeran's path from the streets of Philadelphia through the fighting fields of World War II to the back rooms of organized crime. We have watched Jimmy Hoffa's rise from a teenage organizer in a Detroit warehouse to the president of America's most powerful union. We have looked at the mob people who controlled this world: Russell Bufalino, Carlo Gambino, Angelo Bruno, and all the others who worked in the shadows of American power. We have put back together, as best we can, what happened on July 30th, 1975, when Jimmy Hoffa disappeared from a restaurant parking lot and was never seen again. We have weighed Frank Sheeran's confession, looking at the proof for and against, trying to decide if this man really killed his friend and teacher on orders from the mob. And we have looked at why this story matters, why it keeps fascinating us, what it shows about power, corruption, loyalty, and the American experience. So, what is the decision? Did Frank Sheeran kill Jimmy Hoffa? The honest answer is, we do not know for sure, and probably never will. The FBI believes he was at least involved. Many investigators find his confession believable. Others stay doubtful. The physical proof that would for sure prove or disprove his story does not exist. But here is what we do know. Jimmy Hoffa was murdered by organized crime on July 30th, 1975. Because he had become a problem to their operations. The murder was planned at the highest levels, involved many mob families, and was done professionally enough that 50 years later, no one has been found guilty. We know that Frank Sheeran was a mob enforcer, a killer, someone able to do terrible violence who lived by a code that valued loyalty above all else. Whether he specifically pulled the trigger on Jimmy Hoffa or not, he was part of this world, involved in its violence, bound by its rules. We know that Russell Bufalino planned from behind the scenes, using his intelligence and connections to keep power while staying out of the spotlight. And we know that this story, this meeting of labor organizing, organized crime, political corruption, and personal betrayal, stands for something basic about mid-20th century America, about how power really worked under the surface of democratic institutions and economic prosperity. The mystery of Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance may never be for sure solved. The body may never be found. The truth may have died with the men who knew it. Frank Sheeran, Russell Bufalino, Sally Bugs Briguglio, and all the others who took their secrets to the grave. But the story lasts because it speaks to something beyond the specific facts of one murder. It is about the choices people make, the prices they pay, the weight of loyalty, the cost of violence, and the final impossibility of escaping the results of our actions. Frank Sheeran lived to 83, outliving almost everyone from his world. He got a kind of success, financial security, respect within the mob, survival when many others died young. But in his final years, according to Charles Brandt, he was alone, cut off from his family, haunted by memories of the things he had done. His daughters would not speak to him. His friends were dead. He had his confession, his desire to set the record straight. But what good did truth do him at the end? Jimmy Hoffa wanted power, to return to the Teamsters presidency, to take back his place at the center of American labor politics. Instead, he died violently, his body hidden so well it may never be found, his name forever linked with an unsolved mystery, rather than his real achievements for working people. Russell Bufalino wanted to keep control, to keep his criminal empire money-making and his operations quiet. He succeeded for many years, dying in prison at 91, having avoided the showy violence that destroyed other mob bosses. But his family was effectively destroyed by RICO court cases. His legacy one of crime rather than any real achievement. In the end, what did any of them really get? Money, for a time, power, until it was taken away. Respect within a world that was itself being swept away by historical forces bigger than any single person. The story behind The Irishman is a tragedy in the classical sense. Powerful men destroyed by their own choices, by their loyalty to corrupt systems, by their belief that violence and betrayal could be justified if done for the right reasons or the right people. So now I turn it to you. If you have made it this far through this deep look into one of American history's most fascinating mysteries, you are truly dedicated to understanding this story. I want to know what you think. First, do you believe Frank Sheeran killed Jimmy Hoffa? Or do you think it was someone else? Sally Bugs, perhaps, or another of Tony Crow's crew? Is Frank's confession truth, or the final trick of a dying man looking for fame? Make your case in the comments. Second, what idea about the bodies getting rid of makes the most sense to you? Cremation at a funeral home? Burial at a building site? The rendering plant idea? Something else completely? The body's absence is maybe the most puzzling part of this whole case. Third, who is the most fascinating character in this story? Is it Jimmy himself, the working-class hero who became corrupted by power? Frank Sheeran, the war veteran who became a killer? Russell Bufalino, the quiet don who pulled strings from the shadows? Or someone else? This story has fascinated me for years, and putting together this complete look at the real history behind Scorsese's masterpiece has only made my fascination deeper. The meeting of labor history, organized crime, political corruption, and personal betrayal makes a story more gripping than any fiction, if you are still here. If you have spent these hours with me looking at this dark corner of American history, thank you. You are exactly the kind of involved, thoughtful viewer that makes creating this content worthwhile. Make sure you are signed up to this channel. We go deep into true crime stories, historical mysteries, and the real events behind famous films. Hit that like button if this satisfied your want for in-depth true crime content. And send this to anyone who loves mob history, unsolved mysteries, or just gripping storytelling. The world that Frank Sheeran, Jimmy Hoffa, and Russell Bufalino lived in is mostly gone now. The old mob has been made smaller by RICO court cases and population changes. Unions, while still important, no longer have the huge power they did in the 1960s and 1970s. The special mix of things that made the Hoffa story possible: corrupt union leadership, mob control of labor organizations, political connections reaching the highest levels, has mostly been broken up by reforms and police efforts. But human nature has not changed. The temptations of power, the pull of loyalty, the willingness to justify violence for the right cause or the right person, these stay constant. The Hoffa story is in the end about choices. The choice to go after power no matter the cost. The choice to follow orders even when they go against personal loyalty. The choice to stay silent rather than face results for speaking truth. Jimmy Hoffa made his choices, and they led him to a parking lot in a suburb of Detroit on a July afternoon, where he climbed into a car with people he trusted and was never seen again. Frank Sheeran made his choices, and they led him to a place where older people live and get care in Philadelphia, dying at 83, alone with memories of violence and a confession that may or may not be true. We make our choices too, every day, not about mob hits or union corruption. for most of us, but about loyalty and honesty, about what we are willing to do for success or security, about where we draw our moral lines. The story of the Irishman, the real history behind Scorsese's film, reminds us that those choices have results that echo across many years. That truth has a way of coming out even when powerful people try to bury it, and that no matter how much power you get, you cannot finally escape being responsible, if not to the law, then to history, and in the end, to yourself. Thank you for taking this trip with me. Sleep well tonight, if you can. The ghosts of Jimmy Hoffa, Frank Sheeran, and all the others who lived in this world may be gone, but their story remains. A reminder of the darkness that can lie under the surface of American power and the price that gets paid, in the end, for choosing loyalty to corrupt systems over loyalty to truth. Until next time, stay curious, stay questioning, and remember, every story, no matter how buried, wants to be told, even if it takes 50 years.